Welcome back to Face the Nation. Inflation continues to top the list of Americans' economic concerns, and we learned Friday that they're right to be worried. Prices jumped again at a record-breaking pace last month. CBS News senior national correspondent Mark Strassman has more.
Gas prices feel like highway robbery.
Too damn high. It's ridiculous.
On average, we're now paying more than $5 a gallon, a record, up 16 cents in 1 week and almost $2 more than a year ago. Then again,
for all the complaints that there are out there about gas prices hitting records, few Americans seem to be cutting back much.
Gas prices help fuel inflation that's at a 40-year high. Take groceries. Milk up 20% in a year. Eggs up 75%. Or housing. The average rent costs 15% more. Want to get away this summer? Airfare is soaring, up almost 40% from a year ago.
Still sizzling, just like the economy, America's labor market. Right now, there are roughly 2 jobs for anyone looking for work.
You could not hire enough employees to either produce your product, deliver your product, service your product.
Nearly 1/3 of small business owners say inflation's now their #1 worry, the highest number since 1980.
It's the gas, it's the labor shortage, then the wages. So you get it from all angles when you're a small business.
And 3 straight months of inflation, not just above 8%, but trending in the wrong direction.
I think that bringing inflation down should be our #1 priority.
Expect the Fed to raise interest rates again soon. Mortgage rates have already shot up. A 30-year fixed averages more than 5.5%, more than 2 points higher than January. But make no mistake, taming inflation will take time, maybe deep into next year. Meanwhile, expect to keep paying more. By August, many analysts believe gas will average $6 a gallon.
That was Mark Strassman in Atlanta. We now want to go to Mohammed El-Erian. He's the chief economic advisor at Allianz, a financial services company, and the president of Queen's College in Cambridge. Mohammed, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, let's start with inflation, where everybody else is starting. It's reported the highest level in just over 40 years. How did we get here, and are things going to get worse?
We got here because we got a combination of things happening. Of course, we know about the Ukraine war. We know about the energy transition. Also, the Federal Reserve mischaracterized inflation and fell behind. And all these things came together and are feeding now this everything inflation. The price of nearly everything is going up, and it's making us feel really insecure.
There was some hope in some quarters. It may have been motivated reasoning, but there was some hope that inflation might be turning around, the picture might be getting better. So give us your sense, was that hope misplaced, or is this a sign of how hard it is to predict where we are in the economy at this moment?
It's both. There was hope initially that it is transitory, meaning temporary and quickly reversible. There was hope, as you pointed out, that it had peaked. I never shared those hopes. I think you've got to be very modest about what we know about this inflation process. And I fear that it's still going to get worse. We may well get to 9% at this rate.
I want to get back to that point about modesty, but staying on inflation, how much is this a part of what's domestic U.S. issues? You mentioned some of them. How much of it is what's happening overseas?
It started mainly external, exogenous, if you like, things that we imported. But then the Federal Reserve did not react. It mischaracterized what inflation is, and it fell behind. And the lessons of history is once you fall behind, you lose the ability of the first best response. You end up in this awful situation that we're in today, where you need to make a choice. Do you slam on the brakes hard to control inflation and risk a recession, or do you just tap on the brakes and risk inflation lasting much longer than it should?
So does that mean the Federal Reserve is in the second best response, or are they in the third or fourth best response?
Well, the problem for us all is they're far away from the first best response. I mean, what makes this very frustrating is it was partially avoidable. This is going to have enormous economic, social, it hits the poor particularly hard, institutional, and political consequences. And most of it could have been avoided had early actions been taken.
Looking at what the Federal Reserve is doing, raising rates to try to push down on demand, how is that story going? And will these new numbers, how do you think these new numbers will affect what the Federal Reserve is going to do going forward?
So it's not going well so far because the Fed is yet to explain to us why it got its forecast so wrong for so long. The European Central Bank, they were in the same position. They've explained why. And that's important because until you regain credibility, you cannot get on top of inflation expectations. We should look the Fed to increase by at least 50 basis points this coming week.
Those expectations, the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey showed that people's fears about inflation in the future was going up. Is that related to that lack of confidence in the Fed's ability to bring prices down?
It is. Long-term inflation expectations are now 3.3%, the highest we've seen them for 15 years. People are losing confidence in the ability of the Fed to get a handle on this inflation process.
So, Mohamed, implicit in everything you've been saying and we've been talking about is the murkiness of the picture. Economics is always a little murky. Are we at an extra murky period right now? And does that mean all policymakers are essentially flying, if not blind, they're dealing with something we've never seen before, and therefore humility is even more called for in policy prescriptions?
So humility is totally called for. I was very puzzled when a year ago so many people were so confident that inflation was transitory. There was so much we didn't understand about the post-COVID inflation that humility would have been a good idea. Unfortunately, today, there's a few things we know for sure. This inflation is hurting all Americans, and it's hurting the poor particularly hard. That we know for sure. Second, the longer it lasts, the more it's going to create demand destruction, meaning that the average American not only get hit by higher prices, but they will start worrying about their income. And that is not a situation that we really want to be in.
If that's what's facing the American consumer or the American public, what's your sense? The Economist had a piece about how CEOs did not come up in an age of hyperinflation, that this is the first time for businesses to deal with an inflationary moment. How does that change the toolkit that businesses have to use to face the economic conditions today?
Well, they've got to be both more resilient and more agile. More resilient and be able to absorb the higher cost, and more agile in knowing how much of this they can pass on. It is also difficult for households. We haven't had to deal with this amount of inflation. So it's putting everybody out of that comfort zone. And that's an additional worry that we may not know how to react quickly enough, and we may create a deeper problem. That's why policy leadership is so critical at this stage.
So I'm going to ask you to give the darkest picture as you see it, and then perhaps the most optimistic. Let's start with the darkest in terms of how long economic difficulties might be with us, and what they might look like if things continue to go in a darker direction.
So we're now in a period of stagflation, meaning lower growth and higher inflation. The darkest period is that inflation persists, heads to 9%. People start worrying that it's going to go to 10%. And next thing you know, we end up in a recession. And that would be tragic if that were to happen. Because again, it is the most vulnerable segments of the population that get hit hard. What's the best is that the Fed regains control of the inflation narrative, and we have what's called a soft landing. Inflation comes down without us sacrificing growth too much. Unfortunately, the balance of risks is tilted in the negative way right now.
Let me ask you about stagflation, a word we hear a lot. Feel free to define it a little bit more, and let me ask you this question. I thought that stagflation included also a piece of high unemployment. We don't have high unemployment, so why isn't that a possibly bright sign?
Oh, that's a really good sign. We have a strong labor market, and that's what's keeping us away from a recession right now. That's why a recession is a risk scenario, not a baseline. The one bad thing about our labor market is that we don't have enough labor force participation. We don't have enough workers. We have twice as many jobs that are open that there are workers. And what we need is more workers entering the labor force. That would help tremendously with our economic outlook.
In terms of options, we've talked about the Fed. What other policymakers or areas of help might come to fix the economic situation that America faces?
So number one is, as we talked about, the Fed regaining control of inflation. Number two is focusing more fiscal support on the most vulnerable segment of the population. Number three are what we call restructuring measures, increasing productivity and labor force participation. And finally, let's not forget about financial markets. The last thing we want is financial instability to undermine economic prosperity. So we need more focus on financial stability.
Can I ask you just about the labor force participation piece? What does that mean exactly?
So, for example, better childcare would encourage more women to come back into the labor force. Retraining and retooling would allow more people to re-enter the labor force. We have the people. They are just out of the labor market, either by choice or by necessity, and anything we can do to re-engage them is a win-win.
All right, Mohamed El-Erian, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to be talking to you again. I'm certain of that. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. Thousands showed up and rallied in hundreds of cities across the country yesterday, demanding tougher gun laws. Some of the speakers were mass shooting survivors, including David Hogg, who co-founded March for Our Lives following a shooting at his school in Parkland, Florida, 4 years ago. The message to lawmakers was direct: act now or get voted out.
If our government can't do anything to stop 19 kids from being killed and slaughtered in their own school and decapitated, it's time to change who is in government.
In perhaps a sign of the times, there was some brief panic at the rally here in Washington yesterday when a man yelled and threw an object into the crowd, sending people running from the stage. This morning, we've learned that a bipartisan group of senators have reached an agreement on new measures to address gun violence, with an announcement expected later today. This all follows a string of horrific shootings from Uvalde, Texas to Buffalo, New York. And we now want to go to two researchers who have been studying mass shootings to help policymakers stop the next one. Dr. Gillian Peterson and Dr. James Densley of the Violence Project. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Dr. Peterson, I want to start with you. Let's talk. Describe the scope of your work, when it started, and what your research consists of.
Yeah, we started looking into the life histories of perpetrators of mass shootings about 5 years ago. And our goal was to try to understand, where is this coming from? Why are we seeing this increase? And who are these perpetrators? So we built a database that includes 180 perpetrators who killed 4 or more people in a public space, going back about 50 years. And we coded each of them on over 200 pieces of life history information to try to look for patterns in the data. And we also conducted interviews with perpetrators themselves, people who knew them, victims and experts in the field, to really try to add some data and analysis to understand where this is coming from and what we can do to stop it.
So, Dr. Densley, what composite were you able to come up with, or were you, based on all of these data, in terms of what the typical mass shooter is like?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are searching for a profile of a mass shooter, and we instead saw a pathway to a mass shooting, and we outline that pathway in our book called The Violence Project. So it starts with early childhood trauma. Many of these mass shooters have experienced some pretty horrific things in life, early in life. And this is unsettled, unresolved trauma that I think comes back later in life and is part of what we describe as being a crisis point in these people's lives. Mass shooters are in crisis. These are individuals who are not living their best selves. They are questioning their place in the world. It's often a very sort of suicidal crisis. We see a lot of overlap between suicide and homicide in these cases. A mass shooting is intended to be a final act. And with regard to that, people who perpetrate mass shootings are searching for answers, meaning in life. And so they go searching for the other mass shooters who've done these types of crimes previously. They identify with those individuals. They get radicalized in chat rooms online or reading the manifestos of these individuals. And then finally, the sort of last step with this is access to a firearm. And that's where we spend obviously a lot of time in the policy conversations, but we see all 4 of those steps as opportunities for intervention. They're inflection points, and they're places where we can intervene and prevent a mass shooting, and that's really the key here.
So, Gillian Peterson, one of the things you've written is that to change the mindset about the way we think about these shooters, that they are us. So how does that help in these moments of crisis? Where, for example, would you seek a policy intervention if you change that mindset, if that's the first step?
Yeah, I think we tend to think of the perpetrators who do this as just these evil monsters kind of lurking out there. And of course, what they do is monstrous. But before they do it, they are our classmates, our nieces or nephews, our neighbors, their children going to the school. These tend to be insiders, not outsiders. So the most likely perpetrator of a school shooting is in the classroom. And when we recognize that, I think it kind of shifts our mindset to make us start noticing some of these signs of a crisis, to notice when people are leaking their plans or talking about this kind of violence or talking about suicide. And so our research really points to things like suicide prevention and crisis intervention training, building crisis response teams in schools and workplaces, and having some of those systems in place to catch people before they do this.
So, Dr. Densley, then it's about having therapists in every school. Is that is that essentially what would be the best way to deal with these moments of crisis?
I think what's interesting about this is that a lot of the measures that we would take to prevent mass shootings don't just prevent mass shootings. So we're talking about measures with a broad diffusion of benefits. So this is about trying to capture any student who's struggling in a classroom or anybody in the workplace who is feeling out of place. And so it could be a case of getting therapists or counselors. I mean, we definitely want to improve the student-counselor ratio in our schools. The investments in school security tend to be in more physical measures. We don't recognize that smaller class sizes or having resources in a school for mental health is also school safety. And so this is a major component of this because we're trying to prevent not just mass shootings, but also accidental shootings or suicides and other forms of gun violence. We're trying to ensure that people are thriving in their schools and in workplaces. It's all part of the solution to this problem.
Dr. Peterson, based on the work that you've done, I wonder if you could help me understand a couple of things. One, if these are insiders in these instances, how does that affect the proposals to basically lock up the schools? Second thing, what does your research show you about these drills, the preparedness drills, as they deal with these students? And also, if these are suicides, how does that affect the idea that a good person with a gun can stop a bad person with a gun?
Yeah, I think once you recognize that the most likely perpetrator is a student in that school who is actively suicidal, it makes us think twice about some of these measures. So things like security, I think, make us feel secure, they look secure, it's something kind of tangible, but the reality is the most likely perpetrator is walking in and out of that security every day. You certainly want to have teachers and students prepared for the worst case scenario, but the most likely situation is that perpetrator is running through all of those drills along with everyone else. And if the perpetrator is coming in with a goal of being killed in the shooting or killing themselves, we talked to perpetrators who said, I did this shooting because I wanted to go in and be shot by the school resource officer. So in that case, the good guy with the gun doesn't become a deterrent, it becomes an incentive in some of those cases.
Dr. Densley, what should we take from your work as we think about limitations on gun ownership? For example, the perpetrator's age. How is that affected by these bills to raise the age to 21? What other, when we think of the gun restrictions, matches up with what you found in your research?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's often such a divisive issue, but I want to make sure that I preface this, that we approach this as researchers and not as sort of a partisan issue. And the evidence is actually very clear about this, which is if you want to have a big impact quickly, then the action is with the firearms. And this is not about an infringement upon Second Amendment rights. It's around some reasonable common sense measures. And so some of the things that are being touted right now around age restrictions for accessing an assault rifle, for instance, or safe storage and ensuring that that is enforced, or universal background checks, or doing something around magazine size and magazine restrictions for these firearms. The evidence is really clear that these measures could have prevented some of these mass shootings that have occurred, that we have documented in the database, and that they would ensure that these firearms are not falling into the wrong hands. Time and time again, we see these are individuals who are in crisis. So something like the red flag laws that are being discussed right now, for instance, are really quite interesting, because if this is a person in crisis, that's not the time that they should be going out and purchasing a firearm. And this would put a temporary restriction on someone's ability to do that. And again, it's just temporary, but it gets them the help they need so that they're not using that gun for the perpetration of a mass shooting or any other sort of situation.
Gillian Peterson, you studied the shootings where things went wrong. What about instances in which someone was stopped before one of these mass shootings? What have you learned from that?
Yeah, we also studied cases where somebody planned to do a mass shooting and changed their mind, even cases where the perpetrator actually went into the school with the gun in his backpack and didn't fire it. What's interesting about these cases is time and time again, it seems to be a human connection, just a bit of hope that gets the person through that crisis point. It's somebody reaching out and connecting with them. I think it's so important that we're talking about, gun control and threat assessment and these bigger policies. But then at the end of the day, sometimes it's literally just a human connection with another adult or another person that can get them through the moment.
All right, we've run out of time. Thank you both for your work and for being with us today, and we'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be on the air tomorrow at 10 a.m. on CBS News and our streaming network with the hearing into the January 6th attack. For Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.